Welcome back everyone to another episode of KaijuVFX. Today we're going to create the Showa Gigan eye beam. This has been requested a couple of times in the comments, and I figured I would get around to it because it's a pretty fun and simple effect that we can do here. Now of course the funny thing about Showa Gigan's eye beam is that he never used it. It was only featured in promotional art and the Pipeworks Godzilla fighting games. However, it's become a staple of the character basically. So we're going to sort of recreate what it's like in those Pipework games in this figure. So let's get started. So like always, I have all of my background elements and dust and general stuff that I don't need to cover in this tutorial there. So what we're going to do probably is just honestly disable a lot of this, except for Gigan and like some of the background stuff, just so that we can get a clearer idea of what we're doing. So we're going to create a new solid and we'll call this beam. And we will place this above Gigan. And so if you know me with beams, we're going to add an effect called Saber, a totally free third-party plugin from Video Copilot, and it is absolutely fantastic for making all sorts of beams. I've used it before to create Godzilla's atomic breath, and now we're going to use it to create Gigan's eye beam. So I'm going to go through the presets here and just find something that is going to be a good starting point for us in creating the eye beam. Alright, so I'm kind of feeling the electric preset is going to be a decent starting point for us, and I've already changed the glow color to red because that is the color of his eye beam. So I'm going to play around with the settings on this beam just a little bit, so we might bring up the intensity and maybe the spread just a teeny tiny bit. The bias will probably increase just a little bit, and the core size we might bump up a little bit as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and set this layer to screen. We'll probably mess with the properties of the beam later, but first and foremost, I want to actually get this going. So we're going to move the core end to just sort of where we want the beam to end, and we'll move the start to Gigan's eye. And we'll get this sort of aligned in a way that looks good and natural. Gigan is sort of turning so that he's going to like wipe out this entire scene with his beam. So let's go to the first point that Gigan starts to turn, which is about here. We'll go a couple frames before actually. And we'll set the beam layer to just start right there. We'll press Alt bracket and do that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Control Alt Shift Y and create a new null object. And so we're going to move this just to Gigan's eye real quick. And I've already gone in and rotoscoped Gigan's eye. If you saw the last tutorial, I covered making a glowing eye effect. And so I've already gone in and rotoscoped Gigan's whole eye, like I just said. So it follows him as he's turning, so that we're going to be able to make a super accurate eye glowing effect as Gigan sweeps across the scene. So what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to duplicate the Gigan eye layer and pre-compose it just so we can move all the attributes into it. And we're going to just trim that to there. And we're going to click, and over here in the tracking window, we're going to click track motion. And so we have this tracking point, and we're going to make a quick 2D track of Gigan's eye. And what this is going to help us do is going to help us sort of pinpoint the starting point of the laser so that we don't have to actually animate it going along Gigan's eye manually. We can let the tracker do most of the work for us. So we'll just set the window to be about that size, and we'll only worry about getting the position because we don't need to worry about rotation or scale of the beam. So we're gonna go to the motion target, we'll click edit target, and we'll change that to that null object that we made. And now we are good. If we hit this button, we're gonna analyze forward. Okay, so we've got our track of Gigan's eye going on. It probably won't be perfect, but this is gonna make our lives a whole lot easier when we're trying to animate the beam coming out of his eye. So let's go to that first starting frame. Make sure that you're on the starting frame that you started tracking. That is very important when using null objects for this kind of thing. And we're just going to click on that null object and click apply. We'll play. It's going to say apply dimensions X and Y, and we just hit OK. And we can go ahead and delete that second Gigan eye beam comp real quick. And so if we look at this null object, it tracks onto Gigan's eye. Very, very cool. Okay, so now that we have our null object in the scene fully tracked to Gigan's head, what we are going to do is we're going to actually open the null object, the position keyframes. And so by clicking on the word position, that'll allow us to edit all the keyframes at once. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move all of those to right about there, like where we want the eye to be. And we'll maybe go through and just double check that this sort of tracks through. So now in Saber, we're going to set a keyframe for the core start, and we'll hit U to open up that keyframe. And what we're going to do, in order to track the start of the beam to that null object, we are going to click on the pick whip here, and we are going to parent it not to the null object layer. You need to parent it to the position keyframe property. Otherwise, you'll get an expression error and it just won't work. So we do that. And now if we scrub through, you can see that the start of the beam is tracked to Gigan's eye. So it kind of looks like he's on a leash right now. Okay, so I've gone into the keyframes of the null object and just corrected a couple of things. Just dragged some keyframes over so that the beam more follows the eye track. Like I said, that was a good starting point, but we did have to do some manual stuff in order to get it looking just right, but nothing too bad. So now what we're going to do, we're going to keyframe the core end so that the beam actually, sweeps across the scene as Gigan turns, rather than just having him look like he's on a leash. So I'm just going to go through here and animate the beam end until we find a good selection of movement that works well. Okay, so I've just set a couple of keyframes for the core end, and we have a pretty good looking sweep of Gigan's beam. Nothing too crazy, but it gets the job done. So now I'm gonna want to go into the distortion settings and just play around with the saber. So I might change the distortion of the glow to more of an energy and also increase the scale. And the core distortion might turn up just a tad and also increase the scale of that. And so I'll probably change the wind speed as well of the distortion just so that we can get it to, flow like a beam a lot quicker. Maybe I'll bring that up even more. And we'll do that for both the glow and core distortion. Alright, so I'm pretty happy with what I've created here. Obviously, this is something that you can mess around with on your own. But generally, I just turned up the speed of the core distortion so that the beam actually shoots a lot faster. But yeah, we still have work to do on this though. So we'll go to the start here, and we are going to set a keyframe for the end offset. So we'll click there on the stopwatch and set a keyframe for the end offset to be at 100%. We'll go back to the first frame right before the first frame of the saber kicks in, and we'll set that to 0. So as you can guess, that allows the beam to actually start shooting from Gigan's eye rather than just appearing out of thin air. And so then we'll go to the end here, and I'm going to set a stopwatch keyframe on the core size. And we'll go a couple frames after the beam ends there, and we'll just set the size to 0. Just so we sort of get the effect of the beam closing off, I guess you could call it, after he's done destroying the area. And there we go. So Gigan's beam now closes off and dissipates after he fires it. So one last major change that I want to make to the beam is that there's not that much depth when Gigan has it pass toward the front of the camera. So what we're going to do is we're going to set a keyframe for the end size. So we'll click the stopwatch there once again, and as Gigan's facing right toward the camera, we're going to set the end size to be 200%. And then as he's back facing to a side view, we'll change that to 100. So basically that's going to just let Gigan's beam look a lot more full as it is facing toward the camera. Yeah, so it's a bit of a subtle touch, and you can play around with this depending on how deep you want the scene to look and how far out Gigan should be shooting his beam. But just for the purpose of getting the tutorial wrapped up here, that's going to be fine for me, I think. So the last major thing that I want to show you guys is sort of akin to how we tracked Gigan's beam to his eye. So I'm going to create a new solid real quick. And we'll just put this below my adjustment layer, which is the color grade. And we're going to add optical flares. And I've got a preset already that we can use for this. It's for the Cult of Ray Blood normally. But we'll just use this preset and we will rotate it a bit. We'll position it right where the beam starts. We'll set a keyframe for the position XY. We'll pick whip that to the position of the null object. And there we go. We have a lens flare that, just like that, super easy, follows Gigan's eye. And you can animate the brightness and all that so that it starts and stops, all of which I've covered before, so I don't think it's too important to cover in a ton of detail here. But one last thing that could be fun to do is to add a little bit more detail to the beam going on here. So I'm going to solo this and I'm going to duplicate the beam layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the distortion going on. So we might raise up the core distortion and we'll maybe lower the glow intensity of this duplicated layer. And we'll do the same for the glow, perhaps just a tiny bit. Maybe we'll up the scale of that. And then we'll lower the scale of the core distortion. So that just adds like a little bit more detail to that beam without having to make a particle system or anything. So that'll just be a cool touch to have, I think. Okay, so I think that's going to wrap up this KaijuVFX tutorial. Again, I didn't go over absolutely everything just because I want to just cover the simple effect that you can do. And I cover a lot of other stuff in my other tutorials, like making his back spines glow and whatnot. But yeah, just for simplicity's sake, we'll end things off here. So I want to thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you guys here next time with whatever it is that I have to offer. I would like to give special thanks to GWRzilla, Jimmy Moore, Jeff King, Johnny Sacco, and Jaws Infinity. If you want to learn how you can get your name at the end of each of my videos and tons of other great rewards, be sure to visit patreon.com/DaikaijuLegends.